Hello everyone and welcome to Sullivan County 4-H Learn by Doing Watercolor series. And today we're going to go over some basic techniques in making clouds, different ways that you can make clouds, and also how to scratch out some rocks in your foreground and some other fun little techniques in here. But the big one I wanted to show you today was of course the cloud. And we'll give you a better close-up of this when we're finished with it. But some materials that I forgot to mention that could be helpful is also if you have a hairdryer, you can dry your paper in between your different layers of your watercolor. Of course, you can allow it to air dry as well. I typically just use a hairdryer to slightly speed up the process of it, and also a ruler to help you with your horizon. So let's get started. Okay, so first we're going to start with our sketch, and like I mentioned before, watercolor sketching is very minimal usually because the detail comes in the paint. So what I'm going to do first is make my horizon, and that I do want to be pretty straight because whenever you look at a horizon in nature, it always appears to be perfectly straight. And then you build above and below that for your depth of picture. And what I want to do, I want to show you guys today some techniques with making clouds. So I want a pretty big space for my sky area, and then just some more kind of soft techniques going on. So this is kind of going to be like a meadow, and then maybe we'll just sketch a couple of mountains in the background. Now, I don't want anything to appear to have a pattern to it. I don't really want it to be too straight or anything like that. So I am going to just kind of make the shapes the way that I think would be most appropriate in nature. But there is no rhyme or reason to this part of it, really. Just to add a little depth to the picture. And then in my foreground, since this is going to be primarily meadow, I think that it kind of needs some kind of stability. So I'm going to just add a little rock. Maybe like right there. Just to give the eye some kind of feel of being grounded. And that's pretty much the sketching that I'm going to do. So you'll also notice that my foreground, or my horizon rather, is not splitting the paper in half. I personally think that that tends to draw the eye smack to the middle of that, and it seems a little bit awkward sometimes. In some paintings it can work depending on what's going on in the scene, but as a general rule of thumb, I like to either have my horizon above or below the actual middle of the paper. You won't find that I will put it in dead center, and that's just kind of my taste. Start with, I want the sky to be nice and soft, so I'm going to wet my background first with my water brush. And I'm going to go straight like this. And I'm going to take this all the way down to my horizon line. And you can see that I have a decent amount of water on there, but it's not dripping wet. Alright, I'm going to use cerulean blue for my sky, and I'm also going to add a tiny bit of Prussian blue to it. Alright, now when my paper is wet, it makes the paint lighter, and in general it's good to keep in mind that when watercolor dries, it always dries lighter. So make sure that you make your colors kind of as brilliant a little past as brilliant as you want them to be. And I'm also going to paint, you notice that I went right over my little mountains, little hills in the background. That's because they're going to be darker than my sky in color, so that's okay. That's going to be fine. And in general, the reason why I'm doing it like this is because in watercolor, you always go lightest to darkest because it is easier to darken a color than it is to lighten a color in watercolor. And unlike some of your other paints, you can't exactly layer a light color on top of a dark color. It's very difficult to do that. So just in general, I go lightest to darkest. And you'll notice that in my sky, I'm kind of giving it a little bit of an upward motion with my brush. And that kind of seems a little maybe overkill, but to me, when you can see some of the depth of color in the picture, it makes it not look so flat, even though I'm using only the same color. And I also, in my skies, like to just make one corner kind of a little darker too. It just adds a little depth in my opinion. So the big thing I wanted to show you today is a technique for making clouds, which is patting them out with a paper towel. So I'm going to take a paper towel like this, and I'm going to kind of try to get it so it's rounded, not super like pointy. And I'm going to take it, and on my paper, I'm going to start shaping my clouds. Now I don't want these to be like cookie cutter clouds, so they're going to be kind of funny in shape, but again, that's just, I try to make it as natural appearing as I can. And as your paper towel gets wet, you're going to have to, and this is why I try not to get a corner on it. It is difficult because then you get little squared clouds instead of kind of like rounded. That's better. Clouds. So I'm just going to kind of do that until I like the shape of them. And you can do this as long as your paper is a little bit damp. If it's too wet, your color will kind of flow back in, but if it's too dry, this won't work. And that's just kind of trial and error, finding out where that is. If you make a little mistake like that, you can just kind of paint over it, and it's not a big deal. Generally speaking though, the bottoms of clouds, as kind of odd as it seems, they are typically flat. So you will see that. And then maybe I'll add a little baby cloud down here. It's kind of like that. Some little wispy guys. Okay. Now, to add more depth to this cloud, I'm going to take my rounded brush and a little bit of Payne's Gray that I'm going to water down pretty significantly to make it light. Add a touch bit of Prussian blue in there. Sometimes also, if I'm questioning color, I like to test it on the back of my paper. You can do that. And now I'm going to come back in on top and kind of follow the pattern that I made myself with my paper towel. And again, that looks kind of dark, but this dries pretty light, and I'm also going to do that same method and just kind of soften the top parts of it a little bit so it's not such a hard line. So I'm going to come back in and the bottoms of the clouds are always the darkest too, so that kind of helps anyway. Now you can see that's pretty light, and this is just kind of like what you do is you just start layering like this until you're happy with this shape. Now, a big thing that I have always been told with making skies is that there's no such thing as a perfect sky. Even if maybe you don't love it while you're working on it, it does make a big difference when the whole painting is complete. But there, at some point in time in the existence of the world, there has been a sky that looks like your sky. So don't worry about it. At some point in time, that sky has happened or it will happen. So there's no such thing as a perfect sky. And now we're just gonna kind of come back in on the bottom and do a nice, like that. And we're gonna soften that too. Clouds, when you pay attention to them, so next time you see a nice big fluffy cloud, really take a look at it. They have a lot of dimension to them, surprisingly enough. We just kind of think of them as this big puffy thing up in the sky, but they really do have a good amount of dimension to them. I'm just gonna add a little bit more on the top here. And like I said, you can kind of, that's gonna be a little drier where I patted it out with the paper, so I just touched it with a little bit of water. You do have a finite amount of time that you can kind of play with this. Once it gets too dry, if you go back over it, it might leave kind of like a hard line on your picture. So you can kind of mess with this until you like it, or until you get a little too dry to mess with it any longer. And sometimes, again, when I'm hung up on an area that I just don't love, I will move on to do other parts of the painting, and then oftentimes I'll find at the end it doesn't bother me nearly as much. I see right here I must have scraped my cloud a little bit, so careful of that, but it's okay. Clouds aren't perfect. So that is our cloud technique. I'm gonna dry, well, actually first I'm going to do my mountains, and then I'm going to dry this. So for my mountains, I'm going to use a smaller square brush. And in general, when you're dealing with depth, I'm gonna use a nice kind of forest green. When you're dealing with depth and you're trying to show the difference between something far away and something close up, the further away something is, the lighter in color it is, the softer in color it is, the softer in detail it is. As it gets closer to you, it gets a little darker. So we're gonna kind of follow that same suit. I'm gonna test my color. I think I'm gonna add a little bit of Payne's Gray to that. Yeah, just get it a little deeper, a little bit of burnt umber. I'm going to do my one in the back first, and you can see it already kind of started to dry here, but that's all right. For this instance, it's okay. Okay. It's gonna be one of my mountains, and then I'm gonna darken my color. I'm just going to take it right in front of that other mountain. Add a touch bit of water. Just to give a little depth to the mountain. I never like to have it the exact same color from the top to the bottom, just so that it seems to have a little bit of differentiation. But again, that's a kind of a choice, just personal preference, not a rule. Now I'm going to dry it, and I'm going to cheat. I'm going to use a hair dryer. If you want to, you can absolutely walk away from this and leave it dry, but I'm going to use a hair dryer. But first I'm going to fix this little kind of hook I have. I didn't notice before. Like that. now we're going to do the foreground, and I'm going to wet it slightly. Again, I don't want this part dripping wet per se, just a little. Because I want to blend colors together. Do is just kind of blend a couple of different greens together. So like I said, the further away something is, the lighter colored it is, the closer it is, the darker. So I'm going to pretty much mix up a similar color to what we used for the little background mountains, except I'm going to add some yellow to it once I get that base color the way I like it. And now I'm going to just add some yellow ochre to it. A little bit more green. Just the color on the back. I want a little bit of depth to this when I do it, so I'm just going to start, and I'm going to build my color layers off of that. So this is a little more wet than I usually have it, so therefore we're going to need to add a touch bit more intense color so that it ends up being, because like I said before, watercolor always dries a little lighter, so we're going to need to add some more intensity to that color to make sure it dries a touch bit darker. Start to come in with some darker greens on top of this, some more foresty greens. I'm going to add a tiny bit of actually Prussian blue to really bring out that forest green color like that. Happy with the layering on this meadow. So now I'm going to show you kind of a fun technique that I like to do whenever I want to add a little bit of depth to the picture. And I'm just going to take a small brush and some plain water, and I'm going to flick it on my meadow. And this won't affect this up here because that's bone dry now. But you can see as I flick this on my meadow, it is moving the color wherever the water hits. As long as your paper is kind of damp, not super wet. If it's really wet, these will just fade into the background and you won't really see them. So it does kind of have to be kind of like a medium It's still pretty floppy, but it's not soaking wet. And to me, when I do this in meadows, it gives me the sense of like wildflowers coming up. So I like to just kind of add it like that. I think it's a fun little technique. If you want to have it in specific areas, you can dot it like that, and it will work the same way. If you want to control the size a little bit better, or you need to make a pattern, in general, I like to just kind of let it do its thing. Alright, if you use this technique in kind of an evening painting too, you can oftentimes make them look like fireflies, which I think is also fun. So this technique can be applied to a bunch of different things. So, but now that I'm happy with that, I'm going to hit this with a hairdryer, get it nice and dry. If you saw me kind of touching the paper to make sure that it's dry, just be careful when you do that, when you check it for dryness, because if it is still a little wet and you touch it, you will leave a finger imprint. So just keep that in mind. To me, this piece feels a little too open, a little incomplete, so I'm gonna just add another kind of layer to it. And that's kind of personal preference. If you do a similar piece and you like it this way, then just leave it. Whenever you think the painting is done, that's when it is done. So I'm going to work on the rocks that we said we would put in the foreground, and probably anchor with some grass and such like that. So this technique I'm going to show you with rocks, you really need to get a decent layer of paint. I'm not going to be using a whole lot of water for this, and I want my rocks to be fairly dark. So I'm just using burnt sienna, a little bit of sepia, and a touch of Payne's gray. This color on the back, so I always like to do that. Yeah. Alright. So we're going to get this paint pretty thick, and then I like to try to tempt to make my rocks kind of look like you might not necessarily want to sit on them. So I try to do that and make them have some kind of like unique shape to them, especially when they're in a field like this. And now that technique I was talking to you about with the other side of the brush, I'm going to flip it around, take this, and I'm going to scrape out some. This is why we needed the paint kind of thick. Some details in the rock. Keep in mind, you do have to kind of determine where you want your light source to come from. And if you kind of don't like the way a scrape looks, it's really easy to just kind of go back over it like that. So you can adjust this a few times unless your paper really starts to get damaged if you overwork it a touch. So, there we go. And, of course, you don't have to add that in there. I just kind of like to have something a little more solid to ground my viewer. And sometimes I go back in and I fill in a little color once I think about where my light is. So there we go, that's our rock. And this is kind of, it's not wet, but it can be smudged because it has a lot of paint on it. So before I move on, I am gonna dry that too. be a tiny bit careful. It's not fully set yet. But now, this rock kind of looks like it's just floating in the middle of nowhere, right? I didn't want to put it right on the bottom of the paper because if I were to mat this, then the mat would kind of awkwardly cover up some of it, so keep that in mind. But we definitely need to anchor this guy because he's kind of just floating out there. But now we're going to use that long skinny brush that I talked about in the first episode, and this guy doesn't do good with mixing up paint color because it is kind of a thin brush, so I always use a different brush to mix up my color. We're going to mix up some pretty dark green using the same colors that I've been using to make my greens, hitting it with a little more Prussian blue than before to really give it nice foresty depth. And then a little bit of sepia brown, which is just a super dark brown. Now we're gonna suck it up and kind of, when you pick it up with this kind of brush, you roll it a little bit to try to keep your nice point. Now I'm going to come over here and I'm going to start making some grass. I'll have a little in front and a little behind, but the technique is to just pick your hand up lightly as you go along and make sure you make it all different directions. Grass in nature definitely isn't perfect, so don't get stuck in a pattern because that will become kind of obvious after a while. Having it going in kind of a directional is okay. Like I do, you'll see it's gonna lean a little bit more this way, which I feel like grass does do a bit in nature, just dealing with wind and such like that, but just try not to make it into too much of a pattern. Gonna hit this with some more fresh dark paint now. I don't like to have too much detail right towards the end of my, or the edge of my painting, or something super colorful, just because I like to draw the eye more towards the middle of the painting than away from the painting. So that's, you won't see me usually do too terribly much detail over towards the edge, and again, if we were to mat this and you saw only like one sprig of grass from that side, it might look a little funny. Now I think what I'm going to do is, and this is optional, I think I'm just going to add a couple of little kind of like wildflower texture looking things to complement the detail that we did with adding the sprayed water. Now, I told you, you always paint lightest to darkest in color, in watercolor, so I can't make a white flower, kind of like what those look like, but my green is fairly light, so if I make a yellow ochre, that will probably show up. We'll see. A little bit of an experiment. Do anything too detailed. I'm just going to give the suggestion of a wildflower, and I'm also going to vary the heights of them and do it in a group of 3, just like that. Adds just a little bit of interest to the foreground, not so much that it draws your eye to the bottom of the page, just a little bit, and then I am going to give them a distinct stalk of their own, so they don't look like they're just floating there. Okay. There we go. So that is pretty much it for this guy, and I will, of course, you could go in and you could add more grass to it, which I probably normally would have done, but sometimes when you add too much detail throughout the entire piece, it's hard for your eye to rest somewhere. So this way we kind of direct the eye in a way that this is your anchored foreground, and then you have this space where you can kind of see the differentiation in color and appreciate those little dots that we made, and then you have your very distinct horizon and your clouds. So your eye isn't kind of like forcing to settle on a spot it wants to look at, and sometimes that happens when you have too much detail. If you don't have enough detail, your eye tends to just wander off the paper. So just keep that in mind when you're setting this up. You can definitely add more grass, add more wildflowers, more detail than this one. Okay everyone, that concludes our watercolor piece for today. And again, we focused mainly today on the techniques of the cloud and also the rocks, with some other fun little tips and tricks in between that. So next week we will work on some other techniques as well. So looking forward to showing you guys those. And for more information about Sullivan County 4-H, make sure that you follow the link below. And for more project ideas or tutorials, make sure you check out Cornell Cooperative Sullivan County Facebook page, Instagram, and YouTube. And as always, happy painting.